The courtroom felt colder than it should have, like the air itself had chosen a side. People sat still, not because they were calm, but because something heavy was pressing on every chest in that room. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels full of judgment, full of waiting, full of something that hasn't happened yet, but is already changing everything. Caleb Monroe stood at the front, his hands resting lightly on the shoulders of his 3 daughters, like he was trying to stay grounded through them. Isla stood on his left, her fingers wrapped tightly around his sleeve. Aria stood in the middle, her chin lifted a little too high for a child her age, like she was trying to be brave on purpose. And Amaya stood on the right, quiet, still, watching everything the way children do when they understand more than they should. Across the room, Patrice Hawthorne adjusted her pearl bracelet, her face calm but sharp like a blade wrapped in silk. Gideon Hawthorne stood beside her, tall and composed, his expression unreadable but his presence loud. They didn't look nervous. They didn't look worried. They looked like people who had already decided how this story would end. And that was the problem. Because Caleb didn't have power. He didn't have money that could change outcomes. He didn't have a last name that made people listen before he even spoke. All he had was truth. And truth, in rooms like this, didn't always win. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the tension was already doing her job. Lawyers shuffled papers they had already memorized. Spectators leaned forward like they were about to witness something more than a case. Something personal. Something painful. Caleb bent slightly, lowering himself to his daughter's level. His voice was soft, steady, the kind of voice that didn't break even when everything inside wanted to. "Remember what we talked about?" he said. Aria nodded quickly. "Tell the truth." Isla squeezed his hand tighter, even if it's scary. Amaya didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes steady, and nodded once. Caleb forced a small smile. "I'm right here. No matter what happens, I'm right here." But even as he said it, something inside him whispered that this moment could take everything from him. The bailiff's voice cut through the air. "I'll rise." Everyone stood. Judge Simone Bradshaw entered with a calm that didn't need attention. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She simply took her seat like someone who understood that people's lives were about to shift because of what she would say. "Be seated." The room obeyed. The case began the way these cases always begin, with words that sounded clean but carried weight underneath. Marvin Klein stood first, adjusting his suit like he was preparing for a performance he had rehearsed many times before. His voice was smooth, controlled, confident. "Your Honor, this is a matter of stability, environment, and the long-term well-being of 3 minor children." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Stability, environment, words that sounded harmless but were about to be used like weapons. Marvin continued. "My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne, are the maternal grandparents of these children. They possess the financial means, social structure, and established environment necessary to provide these girls with the future they deserve." Patrice lowered her eyes just enough to appear emotional. Gideon remained still. Marvin turned slightly, his gaze brushing past Caleb like he wasn't worth focusing on. While Mr. Monroe may have been present in the household, presence alone does not equate to capability. That sentence landed harder than it should have. Caleb didn't move. Didn't react, but inside something burned. Because presence was everything. Presence was waking up before sunrise to make breakfast. Presence was braiding hair with hands that had learned through mistakes. Presence was staying up late helping with homework, even when exhaustion sat heavy on his bones. But none of that showed up in bank statements. None of that came with proof that people like Marvin respected. Marvin continued, building his case carefully. "We will demonstrate that Mr. Monroe lacks the financial independence required to maintain the lifestyle these children have been accustomed to. Furthermore, we will present evidence suggesting that his attachment to the Hawthorne estate is not purely emotional." There it was, the implication, the accusation. Gold digger, opportunist, a man who stayed not for love, but for access. Caleb felt Aria shift slightly beside him. He placed his hand gently over hers. Steady, always steady. Judge Bradshaw leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. Mr. Monroe, you will have an opportunity to respond. Mr. Klein, continue. Marvin nodded. Of course, Your Honor. He stepped aside slightly, giving Patrice space. And that's when the real performance began. Patrice stood slowly, gracefully, like she had done this her entire life. Her voice trembled just enough to sound real. We lost our daughter, she said. The room softened. Because grief, when performed correctly, always did that. She was everything to us. Patrice continued, her hand resting lightly against her chest. And now, all we have left of her are those girls. She didn't look at them. Not really. She looked through them. Like they were part of a claim. Part of something she intended to take back. We tried, Patrice said, her voice lowering. We tried to guide her. We tried to protect her. But she made choices that led her away from the life she deserved. Caleb's fingers tightened slightly. Isla leaned closer to him. Patrice's eyes flicked toward Caleb for just a second, cold, controlled. Then back to the judge. And now, she said, we are simply asking for the opportunity to raise our grandchildren in the environment their mother would have wanted. A lie. A carefully wrapped, beautifully delivered lie. Because Belle had made her choice. And it hadn't been them. It had been Caleb. It had been this life, this smaller, warmer, real life. But none of that was being said, not yet. Judge Bradshaw nodded slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne. She turned her attention to Caleb. Mr. Monroe. The room shifted. The air changed. Because now it was his turn. Caleb stood slowly, his movements calm, deliberate. He didn't adjust his clothes. He didn't perform. He just stood there. I'm not a lawyer, he said simply. A few people in the room shifted slightly. Because he wasn't trying to sound impressive. He was trying to be understood. I don't have big words, he continued. I don't have a speech prepared. He looked down briefly at his daughters. Then back at the judge. But I have them. That sentence landed differently. Because it wasn't polished. It was real. I wake them up every morning, Caleb said. I make their breakfast. I pack their lunches. I sit with them when they do homework. I listen when they talk. I stay when things are hard. His voice didn't rise, didn't break. It stayed steady. They don't need a bigger house, he added. They don't need more money. He paused for just a second. They need their dad. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Because everyone in that room felt the difference between what had been said before and this. Judge Bradshaw studied him carefully. Then she leaned forward slightly. And the children? She asked. I would like to hear from them. Caleb's heart skipped. Not out of fear, out of weight. Because this moment, this was where everything could shift. He looked down at them. Arila. Amaya. And for the first time, the room didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a test. Not of law, of truth. Arya stepped forward first. Of course she did. Her voice was small at first, but it didn't stay that way. My dad wakes us up every morning, she said. Even when he looks tired. She swallowed slightly. But he still smiles. The room went quieter. Isla stepped forward next, her voice softer but clear. He makes our breakfast, she said. And sometimes he burns the toast, but he still tries again. A small ripple of emotion moved through the room. Amaya stepped forward last. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She just spoke. Daddy does the work nobody claps for, she said. And something shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But deeply. Judge Bradshaw blinked once. Then again. Because sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It just stands there and refuses to move. The silence that followed didn't feel like the kind people rush to fill. It felt like the kind that forces everyone to sit with what they just heard. Even the people who came into that courtroom, expecting a predictable outcome, could feel something shifting under their assumptions. Judge Simone Bradshaw didn't speak immediately. She leaned back slightly, her fingers resting together, her eyes moving from one child to the next. It wasn't a quick glance. It was careful. Measured. Like she wasn't just listening to their words, but weighing what lived underneath them. Caleb stood still, but his heart was moving fast. He didn't interrupt. He didn't guide them. He trusted them. Because that was all he had. Trust. Arya glanced up at him briefly, then back at the judge. He doesn't forget things, She added like she needed to make sure that part was clear. Even when he's tired, he remembers everything. Our homework. Our snacks. Our stories. Isla nodded quickly beside her. He sings at night, she said softly. He sings the wrong words sometimes, but it makes us laugh. A faint ripple moved through the room again, but this time it wasn't just emotion. It was recognition. Something real. Something people could picture. Amaya didn't move as much as her sisters. She just stood there, her voice calm but steady. When Mommy was alive, she said, she helped with money. The words landed carefully. But Daddy did the home. Another pause. Daddy did the love. And that was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Judge Bradshaw's lips pressed together slightly, like she was holding something back. Her eyes lowered briefly to her notes, but she wasn't writing anything. Because there was nothing to write. The truth had already been said. Across the room. Patricie's posture shifted just enough to notice. It wasn't panic, not yet, but it was discomfort. The kind that comes when a situation stops following the script you expected. Gideon leaned slightly toward Marvin Klein, his voice low. Controlled. Fix this. Marvin didn't respond right away, but his jaw tightened. He stood again, smoothing his jacket, stepping forward with that same polished confidence. Your Honor, he began. While the children's affection for their father is clear, we must remember that emotional attachment does not replace long-term stability. There it was again. Stability. The word he kept returning to. Like repeating it enough times would make it heavier than everything else. These are young children. Marvin continued. Their perception is limited. They cannot fully understand what is required to provide for them in the years ahead. Caleb felt something rise in his chest, but he didn't interrupt. Marvin pressed on. My clients can offer them opportunity, education, resources, things that cannot be replaced by sentiment. Judge Bradshaw raised a hand slightly. Marvin stopped. Yes, Your Honor? I am aware of the factors involved in custody decisions. Her tone wasn't loud. But it was firm. Marvin nodded once and stepped back. The judge turned her attention back to the girls. And you, she said gently, looking at Amaya. Do you feel safe with your father? Amaya didn't hesitate. Yes. The answer was immediate. Clear. Judge Bradshaw shifted her gaze to Arya. And you? Arya nodded quickly. Yes, always. Then to Isla. Isla's voice was softer, but just as certain. He's our home. That sentence didn't echo, it settled. Deep. Because children don't choose words like that unless they mean them. Caleb's throat tightened, but he kept his expression steady. He didn't want them to see him break. Not here. Judge Bradshaw leaned back again. Her eyes moving slowly across the room. She looked at Patrice. At Gideon, at Marvin, then back at Caleb, then at the girls, and something in her expression changed. Not completely, but enough. Thank you, she said quietly. The girls stepped back toward Caleb, and he placed his hands gently on their shoulders again. This time, they leaned into him a little more. Because something had just happened, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. The judge turned to Marvin again. Do you have anything further to add? Marvin hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was small. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But it was there. Yes, Your Honor, he said, though his voice wasn't quite as smooth as before. We would like to submit additional documentation regarding the financial standing of Mr. Monroe. Judge Bradshaw nodded. Submit it. Papers were handed forward. Numbers. Statements. Figures that told a story that looked very different from the one the girls had just shared. Because numbers don't show bedtime songs. They don't show burned toast. They don't show love. Marvin took a breath. As you can see, Your Honor, Mr. Monroe's income is significantly limited. Without the support of the Hawthorne estate, it is questionable whether he can maintain even a fraction of the lifestyle these children have been accustomed to. Patrice lowered her gaze again, playing her role perfectly. Gideon remained still. Caleb looked at the papers briefly, then back at the judge. I won't lie, he said. The room stilled again. I don't have what they have. No excuses. No performance. Just truth. But I show up, he added. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. I show up every day. Judge Bradshaw watched him carefully. "And I will keep showing up," he said, "no matter what it takes." There was no dramatic pause, no speech, just that. And somehow, it carried more weight than everything Marvin had said. The judge exhaled slowly, then looked down at her notes again. This time, she did write something, short, precise. Then she set her pen down. "I have heard enough for today," she said. The room shifted again, because everyone knew what that meant. A decision was coming. Not immediately, but soon. "Court will recess," she added. The gavel came down, and just like that the moment broke. People began to move, but slowly. Conversation started in hushed tones. The tension didn't disappear. It just spread out into smaller pieces. Caleb knelt down in front of his daughters. "You did so good," he said softly. Arya smiled a little. "I told the truth." "I know," he said. Isla leaned into him. "Are we okay?" Caleb hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "We're okay." Amaya studied his face carefully. She didn't say anything, but she saw the part he didn't say. Across the room, Patris stood close to Gideon, her voice low but sharp. "This is getting messy." Gideon's expression hardened. "It won't stay that way." Marvin joined them, his tone controlled. "The emotional angle is working in his favor." Patris's eyes flashed. "Then fix it." Marvin exhaled quietly. "We may need to escalate." Gideon nodded once. "Do it." Their voices were low, but their intentions weren't. Because for them, this wasn't about love. It was about control. And control, once challenged, doesn't retreat easily. Caleb gathered his daughters and began walking toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of what had happened, but because of what was coming. Because something had shifted in that courtroom. But the fight wasn't over, not even close. As they stepped outside, the sunlight hit differently. Brighter, warmer. But it didn't erase the weight they carried with them. Arya looked up at him. "Did we win?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Not yet," he said. And that was the truth. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't telling the truth. It's surviving what comes after. The courthouse steps felt warmer than the room they had just left, but the weight hadn't lifted. It followed them out like a shadow that refused to stay behind. People moved around them, some talking, some pretending not to look, but Caleb could feel the eyes. Not all of them were judging. Some were curious. Some were sympathetic. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered were the three small hands still holding on to him. Arya kicked lightly at the edge of a step as they paused near the railing. "I don't like that place," she said under her breath. "You're not supposed to," Caleb replied gently. Isla leaned against his side. "It smells like rules." That made him almost smile. Amaya didn't say anything. She was watching the parking lot, watching the cars, watching the people, watching patterns the way she always did. "Daddy," she said quietly, "they're not done." Caleb followed her gaze. Across the lot, Gideon and Patris were already stepping into a black car. Marvin stood beside them, speaking in low, controlled tones. "No, they weren't done. Neither are we," Caleb said, more to himself than to her. Naya's voice cut in from behind them. "Good. Because you're not fighting this alone." Caleb turned. Nia Von stood there with her arms crossed, eyes sharp, like she had been ready for this moment before it even happened. She stepped closer, crouching slightly to the girl's level. "My three bosses," she said, her tone softening instantly. "How'd you do in there?" Arya straightened a little. "We told the truth." Nia nodded. "That's exactly what I expected." Isla looked up at her. "Did we mess anything up?" Nia shook her head. "Not even a little." Amaya tilted her head. "They're going to try something else." Naya's eyes flicked briefly toward the parking lot again, then back to the girls. "Probably." Then she stood, her voice shifting back to steady and serious. "Which means we stay smart." Caleb exhaled slowly. "They're pushing the financial angle hard." Nia nodded. "Of course they are. That's their strongest card." "It's also their only card," Caleb replied. Nia gave him a look. "Don't underestimate people like that. When one angle doesn't work, they don't stop. They adjust." Caleb already knew that. He had seen it before. Years ago, back when Belle had first chosen him. Back when her parents had realized they couldn't control her the way they used to. They hadn't shouted. They hadn't exploded. They had simply shifted. Smiled in public. Applied pressure in private. And when that hadn't worked, they had escalated. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck slightly. What do we do now? Nia didn't answer right away. She looked at the girls again, then back at him. We don't panic, she said. Or prepare. Arya raised her hand like she was in class. Do we get snacks while we prepare? Nia smirked. Snacks are always part of preparation. Isla smiled faintly. Amaya didn't. She stepped a little closer to Caleb. We're going home, right? Caleb paused. Just for a second. But Amaya noticed. Because she always did. Nia stepped in smoothly. You're coming with me today, she said. We're going to regroup. Arya frowned slightly. Why not our house? Nia kept her tone light. Because sometimes when things get messy, you go somewhere safe while the grown-ups handle it. Isla nodded slowly, accepting that. Amaya didn't look convinced. But she didn't argue. Caleb met Nia's eyes briefly. He understood. They both did. Because if the Hawthorns were escalating, then home might not stay safe for long. They moved toward Nia's SUV together. The girls climbed in the back, their voices quieter now, their energy more contained. Not gone, just pulled inward. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, watching the courthouse shrink in the side mirror as they drove away. It didn't feel like leaving. It felt like stepping into something bigger, something that wasn't going to be resolved in one hearing. Nia drove in silence for a few minutes, giving space for the noise inside the car to settle. Then she spoke. We need to think 2 steps ahead. Caleb nodded. They're going to try to make me look unstable. Not just unstable. Nia corrected. Unfit. Financially irresponsible. Emotionally overwhelmed. Caleb let out a quiet breath. I'm tired, Nia. I know, she said. But I can't afford to look like it. No, she agreed. You can't. That was the part nobody talked about. Not in court. Not in arguments. Not in polite conversations. The part where you could be exhausted, grieving, stretched thin, and still not be allowed to show it. Because the moment you did, people like Gideon would use it. Caleb looked out the window. They're not going to stop until they take everything. Nia's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Then we make sure they don't get the chance. How? Nia didn't hesitate this time. We build your case stronger than theirs. Caleb frowned slightly. I already told the truth. That's not enough, Nia said calmly. He turned to look at her. She met his gaze briefly. Truth matters, but proof wins. That hit. Because it was real. And we're going to get proof, she continued. School records. Teachers. Neighbors. Anyone who can show what your life actually looks like with those girls. Caleb nodded slowly. I can do that. And we're going to prepare for whatever they throw next, she added. Caleb leaned back slightly. Witches. Nia's voice lowered just a bit. Something bigger. The car fell quiet again. Because they both knew what that meant. The Hawthorns didn't lose gracefully. They didn't retreat. They adapted. The SUV pulled into Nia's driveway a few minutes later. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't flashy. But it felt solid. Lived in. Safe. The girls climbed out, their energy shifting slightly as they stepped into a familiar space. Arya looked around. Are we staying here? Nia nodded. For now. Isla smiled faintly. I like it here. Amaya walked in last, her eyes scanning everything the way she always did. Temporary, she said. Nia glanced at her. Yes. Amaya nodded once. They moved inside together. The house smelled like something warm, maybe cinnamon, maybe something baking earlier. It felt different from the courtroom, different from the mansion. It felt real. Nia clapped her hands lightly. All right. Rules. Arya perked up. Here we go. Homework first, Nia said. Arya groaned. Of course. Then snacks, Nia added. Arya straightened again. We accept. Isla laughed quietly. Amaya didn't react much, but she sat down at the table without being told. Caleb watched them for a moment. And for the first time since the courtroom, his shoulders lowered just a little. Nia leaned against the counter beside him. We're going to get through this. Caleb nodded slowly. I know. But something in his voice said he also knew it wasn't going to be easy. Because across the city, in a much larger house with much colder walls, the Hawthorns were already planning their next move. Gideon stood near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. "I want everything," he said calmly. "Financial records, employment history. Any weaknesses." He paused, listening. "Especially weaknesses." Across the room, Patrice sat with a glass of water she hadn't touched. "He embarrassed us," she said quietly. Gideon didn't turn. "No," he replied. "He delayed us." Patrice's eyes hardened. "The children are becoming a problem." Gideon finally turned. "Then we remove the problem." Patrice tilted her head slightly. Carefully. Gideon nodded once. Of course. Because for them, this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about control. And control, once challenged, doesn't forgive. It retaliates. That night, Nia's house was quieter than usual, but it wasn't empty. The kind of quiet that comes when people are thinking, not when they're alone. The triplets sat at the dining table, their homework spread out, pencils moving slowly. Not because it was difficult, but because their minds weren't fully there. Caleb stood in the kitchen, rinsing a plate that didn't need rinsing. His movements were automatic, like his body needed something to do, while his mind tried to catch up with everything that had happened. Nia watched him for a moment, then walked over and gently took the plate from his hands. "You're going to scrub that thing into nothing," she said softly. Caleb exhaled, stepping back. "I just need to keep moving." "I know," Nia replied. "But you also need to think clearly." He nodded, running a hand over his face. "They're not going to stop, Nia." "No," she said calmly. "They won't." Caleb looked toward the table where the girls sat. Arya was whispering something to Isla that made her smile faintly. Amaya was focused, correcting something with careful attention. "They're trying to take them from me," he said quietly. Nia followed his gaze. "And you're not going to let that happen." Caleb didn't answer right away, because wanting something and being able to protect it weren't always the same thing. "They've got money," he said. "Influence. People who will say whatever they need to say." Nia leaned against the counter. "And you've got truth, consistency, and 3 girls who trust you completely." Caleb gave a small, tired smile. "That doesn't show up on paper." "No," Nia said. "But we're going to make it." He looked at her. "How?" Nia crossed her arms slightly, thinking. "Tomorrow we start building your record." "I already have a record." "Not one that's organized," she replied. "Not one that hits back." Caleb frowned slightly. "Explain." "We document everything," Nia said. "School involvement, teacher statements, attendance records, doctor visits, daily routines. We show a pattern. We show stability." Caleb nodded slowly. "I can get that. And we get people to speak for you," she added. "Like who?" "Teachers. Neighbors. Anyone who sees you with those girls on a regular basis." Caleb thought about it. "Miss Joanna at their school." "Good," Nia said. "Start there." A small voice interrupted from the table. "Daddy." Caleb turned. Isla was looking at him, her pencil paused mid-air. "Are we going back home soon?" The question landed gently, but it carried weight. Caleb walked over and crouched beside her. "We will," he said. "Not a promise. Not a timeline, just intention." Arya leaned forward. "Because I left my favorite hoodie there." Nia raised an eyebrow. "The pink one with the glitter stars." Arya nodded seriously. "It's important." Amaya didn't look up from her paper. "It's not about the hoodie." Arya blinked. "It is a little bit about the hoodie." Amaya finally looked up. "It's about not knowing." The room went quiet for a second. Because she was right. Caleb placed a hand gently on the table. "We're going to figure this out," he said. "Together." Isla nodded slowly. Arya exhaled. "Okay." Amaya watched him for a moment longer, then went back to her work. But something in her eyes said she was still thinking ahead. Always thinking ahead. Later that evening, after homework was done and snacks had been negotiated, the girls settled into the living room. A movie played softly, but their attention drifted in and out. Caleb stepped outside onto the small porch, the night air cooler, quieter. Nia joined him a moment later, handing him a glass of water. "You need to hydrate," she said. He took it with a small nod. "Thanks." They stood there for a moment in silence. Then Caleb spoke. "Do you think the judge believed them?" Nia didn't rush her answer. "Yes," Caleb exhaled slowly. "But belief isn't always enough," she added. He nodded. "I know. They're going to push harder," Nia said. "They'll try to find cracks." Caleb looked out into the dark. "What if they create them?" Nia's voice stayed steady. "Then we expose it." He turned to her. "You really think we can beat them?" Nia met his gaze. "I think we can outlast them." That hit differently. Because winning wasn't always about power. Sometimes it was about endurance. Back inside, Arya's voice carried faintly. "This movie is slow." Isla laughed quietly. "You say that about every movie," Amaya added, "because she doesn't like waiting." Arya defended herself. "I like fast things." Nia smiled slightly. "See," she said. "Life keeps moving." Caleb nodded, but his mind was already shifting to tomorrow. Because tomorrow wasn't going to wait. Across the city, in a much larger house with polished floors and quiet halls, Gideon Hawthorne stood in his study, reviewing a file. Patry sat nearby, her posture perfect, her expression cold. "What do we have?" she asked. Gideon flipped a page. "Limited income. No major assets. No independent property." Patrice nodded slowly. "Good. But strong emotional connection," he added. Her lips tightened. "That can be manipulated." Gideon looked up. "We don't manipulate the children." Patrice tilted her head slightly. "We don't need to." A pause. Then she continued. "We manipulate the narrative." Gideon considered that. Then nodded once. "Marvin will handle it," he said. Patrice leaned back slightly. "He needs something stronger." Gideon closed the file. "He'll get it." Because for them, this wasn't over. It was just entering the next phase. The following morning, Nia's house was already moving before the sun fully settled into the sky. Caleb stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with careful attention. Arya walked in, rubbing her eyes. "You're doing Pancake Friday early." Caleb glanced at her. "Why need something normal?" Arya nodded slowly. "Okay." Isla followed, her hair slightly messy. "Do we still have school?" "Yes," Caleb said. Amaya walked in last, already dressed. "Routine matters." Caleb smiled faintly. "Exactly." They sat at the table, the smell of pancakes filling the room. For a moment, everything felt steady. Not perfect, not solved, but steady. And sometimes that was enough to keep going. The morning moved forward like nothing had changed, and that was exactly what Caleb wanted. Not because things were okay, but because he refused to let chaos rewrite their rhythm. The girls sat at the table eating pancakes, talking about school, arguing lightly over syrup distribution like it was a serious negotiation. Arya pointed at Isla's plate. "That's extra syrup. That's not equal." Isla shook her head. "I earned it." "You didn't earn syrup," Arya said. "Syrup is shared." Amaya didn't look up. "Syrup is not a human right." Caleb almost smiled. For a few seconds, it felt like any other morning, and that mattered more than anything. After breakfast, he helped them get ready, adjusting backpacks, fixing small details, doing all the little things that made their day feel normal. When they stepped outside toward Nia's SUV, the air felt crisp, quiet, like the world hadn't caught up to their situation yet. But Caleb knew better. Because people like the Hawthorns didn't pause, they prepared. The drive to school was shorter than usual, mostly because no one talked much. The girls were thinking, Caleb could tell. When they pulled up, Arya unbuckled first. "We'll be fine," she said like she was reassuring him. Isla nodded. "We know what to say." Amaya added, "We just tell the truth." Caleb leaned back slightly, looking at all three of them. "I'm proud of you," he said. Arya gave a quick nod. Isla smiled. Amaya held his gaze for a second longer, then stepped out. As they walked toward the school entrance, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not fear. Not exactly. More like awareness. That every step mattered now, every interaction, every word. Nia watched them go, then turned to Caleb. "All right. First stop, the school office." Caleb nodded. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and something sweet from the cafeteria. Familiar. Grounding. Miss Joanna Fields, the school counselor, looked up as they approached. Her expression softened immediately. "Mr. Monroe," she said. "I was expecting you." Caleb exchanged a glance with Nia. Of course she was. Miss Fields gestured toward her office. "Come in." They stepped inside. The room was calm, decorated with soft colors and small reminders of student achievements. A space meant to make things feel safe. Miss Fields closed the door gently. "I've received communication," she said carefully. Caleb nodded. "From the Yes." A brief pause. "They've raised concerns," she continued. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Of course they have." Miss Fields leaned forward slightly. "I want you to understand something. I've worked with your daughters for years." Caleb looked at her. "I've seen your involvement," she said. "Your consistency. Your presence. That word again. Presence. But," she added, "they're asking for formal input." Nia stepped in. "And you'll give it?" Miss Fields nodded. Truthfully. Caleb felt a small weight lift. Not gone, but lighter. "I can also gather statements from their teachers," she said. "Attendance records. Participation. Anything that reflects their daily life." "That would help," Nia said. "It will do more than help," Miss Fields replied. "It will matter." Caleb nodded. "Thank you." As they left the office, Caleb felt something new. Not confidence. Not yet. But momentum. Because for the first time since the courtroom, they weren't just reacting. They were building something. Outside, Nia checked her phone briefly. "Next, we talked to their teachers." Caleb nodded. They spent the next hour moving from one classroom to another. Conversations were quiet but meaningful. Teachers who had seen Caleb at school events, who had watched him pick up his daughters, who had noticed the small details that didn't show up in documents. One teacher said, "He's always here." Another added, "The girls are stable, consistent. That doesn't happen by accident." Each word mattered. Each observation added weight. Because this wasn't about proving perfection. It was about proving reality. By the time they stepped back into the parking lot, Caleb felt something settle inside him. Not relief, but readiness. Nia glanced at him. "You're starting to see it." He nodded. "Yeah. They built their case on assumptions," she said. "We're building ours on evidence." Caleb looked back at the school. And truth. Nia smirked slightly. Truth backed by proof. They got back into the SUV, the day still unfolding ahead of them. But across the city, in a much quieter office, Marvin Klein sat at his desk reviewing new information. His expression wasn't as relaxed as before. Because the narrative wasn't holding as easily. A knock came at the door. "Come in," he said. An assistant stepped in, handing him a folder. Additional reports. Marvin opened it, scanning quickly. School involvement. Teacher statements. Consistency. His jaw tightened slightly. Because this wasn't the story he wanted. He leaned back, thinking. Then reached for his phone. "Gideon," he said when the call connected. "We need to adjust." On the other end, Gideon's voice was calm. "Explain." "He's building a case," Marvin said. Stronger than expected. A pause. Then Gideon spoke. "Then we make his life harder." Marvin hesitated for just a second. Because he knew what that meant. But he also knew who he worked for. "I'll handle it," he said. Back at Nia's house, Caleb sat at the dining table going through notes, organizing everything they had gathered. The girls would be home soon. And for the first time, he wasn't just waiting. He was preparing. But somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't the hardest part. Because people like the Hawthorns didn't lose by playing fair. They lost by being exposed. And until that happened, they would keep pushing. Keep testing. Keep trying to break what they couldn't control. Caleb leaned back slightly, staring at the papers in front of him. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Come on." Not a challenge. Not a threat. Just a quiet acknowledgement. That whatever came next, he was ready to face it. The afternoon light stretched across Nia's living room, soft and warm. But it didn't carry the same ease it used to. Caleb sat at the table, papers spread out in front of him, each document a small piece of something he was trying to build fast enough to keep up with people who had been planning longer. He read through a teacher's statement again. Consistent presence. active involvement. Strong emotional bond. He let out a quiet breath. Those words mattered now in ways they never had before. Nia walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and placed one beside him. "You've read that 3 times." Caleb nodded. "Just making sure it says what I think it says." "It does," she replied. "And it's good." He leaned back slightly. "Is it enough?" Nia didn't answer right away. She sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "It's strong," she said finally. "But we're not just trying to be strong. We're trying to be stronger than them." Caleb rubbed his hands together slowly. "They're going to come at me from another angle?" "They already are," Nia said. He looked up. She tapped her phone. "I got a call while you were organizing." Caleb's stomach tightened. "From who?" "School administration," she said. "Someone filed a concern." Caleb went still. "What kind of concern?" Nia held his gaze. "They're questioning your emotional stability." The words landed hard. Not because they were true, but because they were strategic. Caleb let out a slow breath. "Of course they are." "They're building a pattern," Nia said. "Financial instability, now emotional instability. Next will be environmental concerns." Caleb shook his head slightly. "They don't even know what our environment looks like." "They don't need to," she replied. "They just need to create doubt." He stood up, pacing slowly. "So what do we do?" Nia stayed calm. "We counter it." "How?" "We show the opposite," she said. "We show consistency, control, routine. We show that you're not just present, you're stable." Caleb stopped pacing. "I am stable." "I know," Nia said. "But now we prove it." He nodded slowly, trying to steady himself. Because this wasn't just about being a good father anymore. It was about proving it under pressure. The front door opened, and the sound of the girls coming in broke the tension slightly. Arya walked in first, dropping her backpack near the couch. School was boring. Isla followed, quieter but calmer. "We had a test." Amaya stepped in last, her eyes moving quickly between Caleb and Nia. "Something happened," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb forced a small smile. "We're working on some things." Arya frowned slightly. "Is it about us?" Nia stepped forward. "It's about making sure everything stays the way it should." Isla looked at Caleb. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," he said immediately. "Not at all." Amaya studied his face again. "Then why does it feel like we're being tested?" The room went quiet. Because she had said it exactly right. Caleb crouched down in front of them. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people don't understand what's real." Arya crossed her arms. "That's their problem." Isla nodded. "We know what's real." Amaya didn't speak, but her expression softened slightly. Because even in the middle of everything, they still trusted him. And that mattered more than anything else. Later that evening, after dinner and homework, the house settled into a quieter rhythm. The girls sat in the living room, a show playing softly, their energy calmer now. Caleb stepped back outside again, the night air cooler than before. Nia joined him a moment later. "They're escalating faster than I expected," he said. Nia nodded. "That's what people do when they feel control slipping." Caleb leaned against the railing. "I hate that they're dragging the girls into this." "They're not dragging them," Nia said. "They're trying to use them." He looked at her. "And it's not working," she added. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Not yet." Nia crossed her arms. "We need to stay ahead." "How?" She hesitated for a moment, then said, "We might need legal reinforcement." Caleb frowned slightly. "We already have representation." "Yes," Nia said. "But they have more." He understood. "More lawyers, more resources, more ways to stretch this out. Then we get better strategy," he said. Nia nodded. "Exactly." Inside, Arya's voice carried faintly. "Isla, you're sitting on the remote." Isla laughed. "I'm not." Amaya added calmly, "You are." The normalcy of it hit Caleb in a way he hadn't expected. Because everything outside this house felt like pressure. But inside, it still felt like life. Real life. And he wasn't going to let that disappear. Across the city, Gideon Hawthorne stood in his study again, the same calm expression on his face, but something underneath it had shifted. Not frustration. Something colder. Calculation. Marvin Klein sat across from him, reviewing notes. He's responding faster than expected, Marvin said. Gideon nodded once. He's being guided. Marvin glanced up. The woman. Nia Vaughn. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. Find out everything. Marvin nodded. Already in progress. A brief pause. Then Gideon spoke again. The emotional angle didn't break him. No, Marvin admitted. Gideon leaned forward slightly. Then we changed the pressure point. Marvin hesitated. What are you suggesting? Gideon's voice stayed calm. Why make it harder for him to maintain control? Marvin understood immediately. But he didn't respond right away. Because even for someone like him, there were lines, and Gideon didn't care about them. Patrice entered the room quietly, her presence sharp. Is it handled? She asked. Gideon didn't look at her. It will be. She nodded once. Good. Because for her this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about restoring what she believed was hers. And she wasn't used to being denied. Back at Nia's house, Caleb stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The girls were curled up on the couch now, half watching the screen, half drifting into sleep. Arya looked up at him. Are we okay? He didn't hesitate this time. Yes. Isla smiled faintly. Amaya watched him for a second longer, then nodded. Because even though everything around them was shifting, one thing hadn't. He was still there. And for now, that was enough. The next morning came with rain, soft at first, then steady against the windows. Caleb woke before everyone else, not because he was rested, but because his mind had refused to sleep. He stood in Nia's kitchen while the coffee brewed, watching water slide down the glass like the whole sky was tired too. On the table sat the folder they had built piece by piece. Teacher letters, attendance records, medical forms, photos from school events, notes from neighbors, proof of the life he had been living without ever thinking he would have to defend it. Nia entered quietly, tying her robe. You slept. Caleb gave a small laugh without humor. That means no. He looked at the folder. They're going to try something today. Nia poured coffee into a mug. Then we answer it. He shook his head. I keep thinking about Belle. She would hate this. Nia's expression softened. She would hate what they're doing. But she wouldn't be surprised. Caleb looked down. That was the painful part. Belle had known her parents. She had loved them once in the way children love parents, before they understand the cost of that love. But she had also feared what they could become when they were denied control. From the hallway, small footsteps approached. Isla peered first, holding Belle's scarf close to her chest. Daddy, she whispered, are we going back to court? Caleb crouched. Yes, baby. Arya walked in behind her, hair messy. Face serious in a way that didn't belong on her. Do we have to talk again? Maybe, Caleb said honestly. Amaya came last, already dressed. Then we will. Caleb looked at all three of them. And for one moment the fear almost won. Not because he doubted them, but because he hated that they had to be this strong. You don't have to be brave every second, he said. Arya shrugged softly. We know. Isla nodded. But we can be brave for a little while. Amaya stepped closer. And you can be brave after. That broke something in him gently. Not enough to fall apart. Just enough to remind him what he was fighting for. The courtroom was fuller this time. Word had spread. People who had heard pieces of the story had come to watch. Some from the school. Some from the neighborhood. Even Miss Joanna Field sat near the back, hands folded tightly in her lap. Patrice arrived in navy blue this time, no white, no soft innocence. Gideon looked composed, but his jaw was set harder than before. Marvin Klein carried himself like a man with one more card to play. Judge Bradshaw entered, and everyone rose. When they sat, Marvin stood immediately. Your Honor, new concerns have emerged regarding Mr. Monroe's emotional stability and ability to provide a secure environment. Caleb felt Nia stiffen beside him. Marvin continued. We have received statements suggesting Mr. Monroe has been under severe distress, that the children have been displaced from their home, and that their current living arrangement is temporary and unstable. Temporary. Unstable. The words were chosen carefully. Judge Bradshaw looked at Caleb. Mr. Monroe. Deshaun Pierce rose before Caleb could speak. Your Honor, the children were displaced because the Hawthorne family removed them from the property immediately after losing their custody petition. A murmur moved through the room. Judge Bradshaw's eyes sharpened. Is that accurate? Marvin adjusted his jacket. The property matter is separate. Answer the question, the judge said. Marvin paused. They were asked to vacate pending estate proceedings. Judge Bradshaw looked toward Patris and Gideon. The morning after my ruling. Neither answered quickly enough. That silence spoke. Deshaun stepped forward with the folder. Your Honor, we have submitted documentation from the children's school, medical providers, neighbors, and community members. The record shows Mr. Monroe has been the consistent primary caregiver for years. Not temporarily, not conveniently, consistently. Judge Bradshaw opened the folder and began reading. The room waited. Every page turned felt like a breath. Marvin tried again. Your Honor, affection cannot erase financial reality. Judge Bradshaw didn't look up. And money cannot create parental attachment where it does not exist. Patrici's face tightened. Gideon leaned back, eyes cold. Then Judge Bradshaw looked at the girls. Children, I understand you spoke before. I will not force you to repeat pain. But I need to ask one final question. Caleb's hands tightened in his lap. The girls stood together. Judge Bradshaw's voice softened. Do you understand what is happening here? Isla looked at her sisters, then answered first. They want to take us from Daddy. Arya added. They say it's because they can give us more. Amaya looked straight at the judge. But more things is not more love. The room went still. Judge Bradshaw blinked slowly. Isla stepped forward, clutching Belle's scarf. When Mommy was sick, Daddy didn't leave. When Mommy died, Daddy didn't leave. When we cried, Daddy stayed. Arya's voice shook, but she forced it steady. Grandma and Grandpa came after Mommy died. Not before. They didn't know our teachers. They didn't know our bedtime song. They didn't know Arya hates peas. Isla whispered, You are Arya. Arya wiped her cheek fast. I know. I'm emotional. A small, broken laugh moved through the courtroom, but it faded quickly. Amaya spoke last. Our dad is tired, she said. But he is not broken. He is sad, but he is not unsafe. He doesn't have their money, but he has us. And we have him. Judge Bradshaw lowered her eyes. For a second, she wasn't the judge. She was just a woman listening to children explain love better than adults could. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. The courtroom froze. Judge Bradshaw wiped one tear quickly, then another, but she didn't hide the feeling completely. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't want to. These children, she said, her voice firm despite the tears, have answered with more clarity than most adults who enter this courtroom. Patris stood suddenly. Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. Judge Bradshaw's face changed. Sit down, Mrs. Hawthorne. Patrice remained standing. They are children. They don't understand what they're losing. The judge's voice hardened. They understand exactly what they are being asked to lose. Gideon rose halfway. This is outrageous. The gavel slammed. Sit down. The sound cracked through the room. Both of them sat. Judge Bradshaw looked at Caleb. Mr. Monroe. This court recognizes your role as the primary caregiver and finds no credible evidence that removing these children from your custody would serve their best interest. Caleb stopped breathing. The judge continued. Custody remains with the father. The grandparents' petition is denied. Isla gasped. Arya grabbed Caleb's arm. Amaya closed her eyes like she had been holding herself together by force. But Judge Bradshaw wasn't done. Furthermore, she said, looking directly at Patris and Gideon, any further attempts to harass, displace, intimidate, or interfere with Mr. Monroe and these children will be reviewed by this court. Patrice's mouth opened, but no words came. Gideon looked furious, but trapped. For once, money had no doorway. For once, control had nowhere to stand. Caleb pulled his daughters into his arms. He didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't smile like a winner. He held them like a man who had almost lost the whole world and had just been allowed to keep breathing. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The pavement shined under a pale strip of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Arya looked up. So now did we win? Caleb looked at his daughters, then at Nia, then back at the courthouse doors behind them. Yes, he said softly. This part we won. Isla held Belle's scarf tighter. Can we go home? Nia stepped closer. You already are home, sweetheart. Wherever your dad is. Amaya nodded. That's what we told them. Weeks passed, and life did not become perfect. It became real again. There were still legal papers. Still estate issues. Still grief that showed up at strange times. But the fear of being torn apart no longer ruled the house. Caleb found a smaller place with sunlight in the kitchen and enough room for 3 beds, 3 backpacks, and too many opinions. The girls decorated the fridge with drawings, schedules, and one note in Arya's handwriting that said, "No evil grandparents allowed without appointment." Isla taped Belle's scarf near a framed photo. Amaya organized the homework shelf. Arya named the toaster Betrayal because it still burned bread. And Caleb kept showing up, every morning, every night, every ordinary moment that nobody clapped for. On the first Friday in their new home, he made pancakes. One came out too dark, one came out too pale, and one looked almost perfect. Arya stared at the plate. Daddy, these pancakes have been through a journey. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Are you complaining? No, she said, grabbing the best one. I'm honoring their struggle. Isla laughed. Amaya poured syrup carefully. Routine restored. Caleb looked at them and felt Belle there, not like a ghost. Not like pain, but like warmth. Like memory had stopped stabbing and started holding. Later that night, after homework and dishes and one argument about who touched whose hairbrush, Caleb stood in the hallway listening to the girls laugh in their room. Nia came by with a box of old documents Deshawn needed. She paused beside him. They sound better, she said. Caleb nodded. They are. And you? He looked down the hall. I'm getting there. Nia smiled gently. That counts. When she left, Caleb walked into the girls' room. Arya was upside down on the bed. Isla was writing a note to Belle. Amaya was reading, pretending not to listen. Caleb leaned against the doorframe. Bedtime. All 3 groaned. He started singing anyway. Off key and wrong in at least 3 places. Arya covered her ears. Mummy would have corrected you. Caleb smiled. I know. Isla whispered. She probably still is. Amaya looked up. Keep singing. So he did. Badly, softly, faithfully, because love was not always grand. Sometimes love was a tired father singing the wrong words in a small rented house while 3 girls fell asleep feeling safe. And if there was one truth the Hawthorns never understood, it was this. A mansion can hold furniture, money, portraits and power. But a home is built by the person who stays.